Hey, one more thing before you go. In a world consumed by digital distractions and societal pressures, there arises a beacon of hope. Are we in the fight for a better tomorrow? Can we defy the odds and build a future where quality of life reigns supreme? We all seek quality of life in some form or another. Stay tuned as we have a conversation about a roadmap to restore the quality of life in the great age of addiction, where moderation might be the key to reclaiming our humanity. I'm your host, Michael Herst. Welcome to One More Thing Before You Go. My guest is Jeff Epstein. He's a faith-based father, husband, sibling, and a friend. Also a widely published author, a speaker, producer, and a digital media pioneer long ago turned digital apostate. We're going to talk about that. The New York Times referred to him in the early 21st century as the Mick Jagger of digital media. He's a former digital media pioneer who wrote the first major how-to book series on personal computers and the first digital advertising agency, both dating back to the mid-1980s. He turned digital apostate in the early 21st century when he became the first to explore what he's called the default meta addiction, all things media and all things digital. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. I'm very happy to be here, Michael.
What a journey that you have been on. I mean, we all rely on digital media, but being a pioneer at the beginning of this, I won't call it the age of innocence.
No, it's hardly that. No, it's like the old Grateful Dead lyric of what a long, strange trip it's been. I started out, actually, it's back in the mid 1980s. I was working for a large Madison Avenue ad agency at the time. And I wrote my book series while I was still employed there. In fact, I put together what I referred to as a cockamamie 4-page proposal on how, for a 7-title book series called Einstein's Computer Guides. This was back in 1983. And one day I was on my way to the men's room, and I always take something to read, and I couldn't find anything. And so I grabbed this Wang Office 25 word processing manual off a shelf in the hallway. And I was sitting down in the men's room and I was looking at it. I couldn't make heads or tails of it. I said to myself, I can do a much better job than this. And this is when all these major manufacturers were introducing home computers, personal computers, for what they thought would be a robust home market, which of course didn't materialize until the internet came along in the mid to late 1990s. But I put together this 4-page proposal, and in it I stated that I set out to cure the two basic ills of all computer literature or all technical literature. One, which was technical overkill, which happens when authors would rather showcase than share what they know. And since I'd never touched a personal computer, I didn't have to worry about that. I didn't know anything and couldn't technically overkill anybody with it. And the other problem is bad writing, which is bad writing no matter how much you know. And I'd always been a good writer, so I felt eminently qualified to write about these things I'd never touched. And a couple of weeks later, I got a call from the acquisitions editor at Harcourt Brace Jovanovich after my agent sent out this book proposal. And the acquisition editor says to me, Mr. Einstein, it's not too often we get someone trying to pitch us a 7-title book series based on their ignorance. And he said, I have just one question before we ink the deal. And I thought to myself, oh no, he's going to ask me if I really don't know anything about computers, and it's going to queer the deal. And instead he asked me if my last name was really Einstein. I told him, no, it used to be Hemingway, but no one reads Hemingway anymore. So Einstein was just the best I could do on such short notice. And that's how I got in the computer business. And then later on that same year, I co-founded, with a dear friend, Einstein and Sandom Interactive, which was the first digital ad agency, clearly the byproduct of a couple of guys with way too much spare time and expensive drug habits to afford. That's how history's made.
That's how history is made, exactly. And brilliant answer, by the way. Brilliant answer. You combine two geniuses and two genius names right off the bat. Slam, bam.
I like Hemingway.
It's interesting. My first introduction to any type of digital media was when I was in law enforcement, actually, because obviously there were computers, but the computers were mostly what we called in for getting a CCIC check, a National Crime Information Center check, or a local Colorado Crime Information check when we're running stuff on people, whether or not they've got a warrant out for them. And, that was the extent of the computer portions in the beginning of it. Now every cop car out there's got a computer on it that access anything, anytime you want. You make a traffic stop, you can run your own plate. You don't have to call it in even. Even let dispatch know that where you're at and what you're doing. You can run the person sitting in the car. You pull their driver's license instead of having to wait for dispatch to call it in. It's right in front of you, which I think, from that perspective, the tools of digital obviously have evolved to such a point that it's beneficial in many, many ways, like this conversation we're having today. But I think it's a double-edged sword because at the same time, what we see is kids and people sitting at a dinner table, even in a restaurant, everybody's looking down at their phone and scrolling instead of having a conversation.
Correct.
It
Correct.
it creates, I think, an environment that I like how you put it because I never thought about it that way before, which we'll go into more in depth here in a few minutes. But as an addiction,
Yes.
I think that we all
Plain and simple, like any other narcotic and any other
yeah,
addiction.
it's crazy. I mean, obviously, in my lifetime and in my background and in my previous profession, my lifetime dealt with addiction with my parents. They both were alcoholics. I call that an addiction. I have friends of mine that were into drugs. They did cocaine. They did, they smoked pot. They did mushrooms. They did, everything they get their hands on. And they were addicted to those kind of things. So my familiarity with that is old-fashioned because I grew up around that. I worked in an environment around that. But coming into the digital age, it showed me a new type of addiction, especially having kids.
Yeah.
It opened my eyes up to a new era of addiction, I think. And
Sure.
realistically, I know you didn't go to college. You said you didn't go to college?
No. No.
But yeah,
No. I was too busy avoiding armies.
I, I do love the statement that I mentioned in the beginning. You're the best 8 years of your life. That's
No, it was actually the statement was that I described my 4-year high school career as the best 8 days of my life.
8 days. I'm sorry, I messed that
Yeah,
one
I
up.
only showed up 2 days a year.
Uh,
Well, either way, it works.
the way it works, it's yeah. I relate to that. I didn't take my education
I'm glad.
seriously until I had to pay for it when I went to college. Then I
Yeah.
went, oh crap, I got to pay for this.
Yeah.
I better listen. But yeah, it's what I mean. Obviously, you were into marketing in your early age. You mentioned that earlier. So, what did you want to be when you grew up? Did you always want to be into marketing?
I remember on career day, I was in fourth grade. So I was like, I guess 9 years old or something at the time. And all the fathers came because none of the women worked back then. All the wives were housewives, took care of the home. I shouldn't say they didn't work; they worked like dogs, but they took care of the homes. And I remember going around the room after the presentations from the various fathers. My father couldn't make it that day; he was out at the ballpark. He was a baseball writer, and and they went around the room and they asked kids what they wanted to be. And this was back in the days of JFK and John Glenn and and Mickey Mantle and Willie Mays, and all the kids would say, I want to be like JFK, or I want to be president of the United States. I want to be an astronaut. I want to be a baseball player. And when he came to me, I said, I want to be 35. Because that's always how I saw myself. I always saw myself at the age of 35, and that became my life's ambition to survive until I was 35. Of course, once I hit 35, I had to upwardly navigate my life's ambition, and it became 50, and then I surpassed 50. Now my life's ambition is 75, which is only 3 years away. But I like to set ambitions for myself that I can realistically achieve. So 75 seems to be it for now.
Well, it's an amazing. I mean, I remember those days. I was a space fanatic, watching everything. My father,
Yeah.
when I was a child, my father was a reporter as well. He was a news reporter, but I was lucky enough to go with him when JFK came into Colorado Springs. And as a child, very very small child, I was able to meet John F. K. I don't
Cool.
remember it because it was way
Uh,
back then.
I, I think for me, the lack of a true career objective or career path was what allowed me to be in certain circumstances, in certain places, in certain times. I describe my career as a litany of accidental firsts. Um, and it only happened because I didn't carry any baggage with me wherever I went. I have no formal body of knowledge to defend. I don't care what
Right.
worked yesterday. I'm only interested in what's not working today. And as a manager, as an executive in my own companies and working for others later on, I would always sit down with my employees and I tell them, listen, I'll give you all the tools you need to do your job and get the job done. I'll give you, I'll always have your back. I'll always be there for you. I'll always defend you. But I ask one thing in return, and that's whenever we sit down, tell me the bad news first. I can't help you unless I know what's not working. So I always wanted to turn my attention to the things that weren't working. And that's why people ultimately, in the end, when I became a consultant and stepped out of my own ad agency, went to work for other people on a hired gun basis, and they would hire me because they had some sort of bottleneck going on and they couldn't figure it out. And my particular skill is that I see patterns at 65,000 feet, and I've built enough things from the ground up myself to know how to translate those patterns into boots on the ground action.
That's amazing. I think and life experience and getting into the middle of it is sometimes a better education than going to college. You
Well,
know,
I wouldn't know, but just from having talked to all the college graduates around me, I suspect you're right.
as an individual that I grew up with dysfunctional parents. My father died when I was 17 years old, and seen him since I was 15 years old. So I grew up with a single mother, trying to raise three kids, and struggling through that. Back in that age, like you had said earlier, you know, mothers didn't usually work outside the house, and she would get a job as a secretary or a teletype operator or something that was not paying very much, too many hours, and gone all the time. And growing up in that environment, my aspirations were to come out of that environment, to come out of where we grew up with, not having enough food on the table, not knowing where, what the next day was going to bring us, or whether or not we were going to get, my mother got the rent paid, and things like that. So I understand the adaptation portion of it. I understand the struggle coming from that perspective, but it gave me the fortitude to go into my career in law enforcement, to be able to utilize those skills coming from that environment that I never would have gotten from college.
Yes, I think that's exactly right, and I think that's how the way life works. Um, Part of the digital downside in digital technology at scale, where it's pervasive and immersive, and everything is digital at its roots, the entire raison d'etre that's given to us as consumers in the 21st century is that this is going to make your life easier and more convenient. We're going to eliminate all the friction from the transactional day to day life. And that's the essential promise of every app on your smartphone, of every piece of software you own, that in some way, shape, or form, it's going to facilitate your life and remove a piece of friction from your life. But I've always been of the notion that the quality of life is very much a byproduct of the deliberate friction that we create for ourselves. Those moments that we take to slow down, smell the coffee, and insert some sort of meaningful ritual between us and the rest of the world. And that's what protects the quality of life for ourselves as individuals, for our families, and for our communities. And that's something I started to realize in the mid 1990s, just as I was stepping out of digital. I was already the old man. The New York Times called me the Mick Jagger of digital media, but that was only because I was the ugly old white guy who still knew the lyrics to the songs in an industry of really good-looking young hipsters. So the idea that we should somehow look to automate every function of our life and institutionalize every function in our life, which is exactly what those apps represent on your phone. They represent relationships with institutions that you most likely didn't have 15 years ago, and almost all those institutions are too big to fail, and they're not there for your benefit. They're there for the institution's benefit. We don't own our smartphones. Our smartphones own us. No doubt about it.
That's a profound statement. I wholeheartedly agree with that. I got in, from my own perspective, I got in to using computers at home at a very early age. At the very beginning, I had a Commodore 64. In 1984, I bought an Apple II machine, which I just saw one. I just saw one auctioned off for like $500,000. I should have kept it.
I know.
Hindsight's 2020. But of course, at that time, they go, "Oh, but we have a bigger and a better one. Why don't you trade that one in?"
Mm-hmm.
You don't think that. Well, 30 years down the line, it's going to be worth $500,000. But I found that in certain instances in the beginning, computers were valuable to us because it allowed us to be able to function in a new way, in a very unique way in regard, especially when I started getting in my law enforcement career, because it allowed me to write my report instead of handwrite a 20-page report. We could type a 20-page report, kind of thing. But then you have the other hassles that came with it. It was, the paper that it printed on, of course, was the old dot matrix. So it would jit back and forth and things like this. It eventually evolved into something that was much quicker and easier with everything we have today. But when I got my first cell phone, it was like freedom for me. When I got my first iPhone, it opened a whole new world and a whole new digital world to me. And what you say in that regard, I believe, is my cell phone goes with me everywhere. And if you walk out the door and you leave it, you go, crap, I left my phone.
Well, if we look back to how these and where these digital devices that we carry so casually around with us 24/7, where they came from, you realize that not one of these digital devices, and nowadays they all boil down to the smartphone. We carry all these digital devices that used to be separate and discrete. They're all sort of compacted into one device now, in the smartphone. But in the timeline of these devices, we have to realize that not a single one of them was, and smartphone included, was designed to improve the quality of our lives. All of these devices were designed as office productivity tools to enhance the productivity in the office place. And these things emerged in the 1980s and early 1990s. And then as the internet opened up and broadband bandwidth became the rule rather than the exception in the early 21st century, all of these digital devices, the laptop, the cell phone, the mobile phone, and everything's driven by the same mama lotion, the same mother tongue spreadsheet, electronic spreadsheet. They all basically became migrated into the smartphone and into our homes and into our lives. And they basically perform as if, again, the primary function is as a productivity tool to enhance the corporate bottom line. And our smartphones are still designed to do that explicitly, only we're told that they're there for us. And in some ways, of course, it's a liberation when you don't have to go to the friggin' bank to deposit your check and you can do it with your smartphone instead. They all have quid pro quos, but that doesn't distinguish it in any way, shape, or form from any other addiction to any other narcotic. They all have quid pro quos. They all take away the pain. They all provide diversion, all of them. So in that regard, I call the smartphone history's most perfect narcotic. And in that regard, it behaves in our blood chemistry, in our brain chemistry, exactly like any other narcotic or narcotic behavior, regardless. So there's always a price to pay for all these things. I started back in the mid 1990s when I started stepping away from digital. I was beginning to have second thoughts about my own contribution to the timeline and the course of world events in that regard. And because I saw what was happening to my own life in New York City, I noticed how everything was speeding up around me. I noticed how everybody I was involved with was already just half my age. Everybody's in their 20s. Everybody had an MBA. None of them, and all of them were dealing with promiscuous investment capital, venture capitalist money and investment capital, just all over the place. That money that came so quickly and easily to them just out of college confirmed the fact that they'd never been wrong. So it was impossible to deal with them on a certain level because they were utterly intractable. They'd never failed. And the only people that are worth that can really discuss the pros and cons with any kind of alacrity at all are people who have failed. That's why I call myself an apostate, the digital apostate, because I essentially gave up my digital career when I realized that things were turning south, not just for myself, my own quality of life, but that the writing was on the wall for what would come in the next millennium, when in the 21st century was only 4 or 5 years away. So that's when I basically I built the first two tools in the quality of life toolkit. They both date back to 1996. The My Ritual Inventory and the Centrifugal Map were tools that I built for myself in order to slow myself down when I saw what was going on. And then come the 21st century, I turned digital apostate, which means I started writing and speaking publicly about the digital downsides, chief among them what I called a meta addiction to all things media and all things digital, which raised the question, what happens to the quality of our lives? What happens to our spirituality and our faith, our time, and our money when addiction becomes the rule rather than the exception, which is exactly what happened. So suddenly everyone was an addict, and digital became the great gateway drug to everything else, which kind of makes a lot of sense if you look at consumerism in a certain way as a pathway to addiction. Addiction is the only pure consumer demand. Everything else is manufactured.
I agree with that. And, realistically, growing up watching the Jetsons and seeing everything is automated and having Rosie the robot and, things like this and talking to the computers or watching Star Trek, growing up watching Star Trek. Star Trek, they had like communicators, but they had the first, what we now see as an iPad or an iPhone and things like that. You get fascinated with, boy, that could be great. That's great. That's great. I really want one of those. I can't wait till we get to that point. And so, of course, when we get to this point, we have smartphones. We've got, I don't want to say her name correctly, but Lexi, if you know what I'm saying, because now instead of having to pull a book out and look something up, I can ask Lexi. So I think in certain circumstances, it benefits us because I don't have to have a wall full of encyclopedias just pull out and start looking through. Or if I'm doing research on something, it gives me the opportunity to do deeper research. But then I find myself not doing math anymore.
Yeah, there's a definitive quid pro quo. Every time we decide to put down something from the past and pick up something in the future that's going to facilitate, make things easier for us, the question is, what happens to us over time as our lives become correspondingly quicker? I'm not going to say easier because I don't know anybody at this stage of the game, 20 years, a full generation and change into the digital lifestyle. I don't know anyone whose lifestyle is easier than it was 25 years ago. 25 years ago, before all this happened, people would sit down and have a leisurely dinner. Now we find, or people would take, 30 or 40 years ago, people would take the Sabbath day of rest. Those are both meaningful rituals that have their nexus, their foundations in spiritual well-being that were both eliminated in the second half of the 20th century. The family dinner table was primarily a religious call to action. You bring the family together to pray first, and only then you eat and you talk and you find out what's going on with each other, and there are calls to action that come out of that. That was like the original local news was the family dinner table, and it was the only local news that was actionable in our lives. You found out the neighbor down the street had lost his job after 20 years, and you could do something about it. You could give him a call on the phone, or you could go pay a visit, take a plate of cookies or something, tell him things will be okay, or Aunt Millie's poodle is sick. Hey, kids, let's all give Aunt Millie a call after dinner and see if we can help out or cheer her up or something or other. And what happened at the PTA? Let me tell you what happened at the PTA. Well, we're going to have to go take care of that next time, or go meet with your teachers and see what's going on. And the level of engagement with each other, first and foremost, was a primary concern coming out of a spiritual place. And I always say that there are four, and I talk about this a lot in the quality of life resistance movement, that there are four basic needs. And in order, in terms of satisfying them, in order they are spiritual, social, emotional, and physical. That once you eliminate the spiritual connection, everything else tends to degrade after that. So once we got rid of the family dinner table, which was the primary familial spirituality and point of spirituality, where people came together and they prayed together and then they talked. Once you got rid of the family dinner table, you got rid of the spiritual at the top of the food chain, and you also got rid of the social, because the spiritual informs the social, because everyone's connected the same way in that regard. Once you got rid of the social, it opened up all sorts of emotional problems. We saw that very starkly in COVID with in the lockdown towns and states, that people, and young people in particular, were just devastated by the isolation imposed by COVID lockdowns and closing the schools. And then once you're sick emotionally, because you have no one to talk to, you're isolated socially, and because you're isolated socially from the spiritual connection that binds us all, that all manifests physically. So think about what the promises leading into the 21st century. We had the promise of, the promise of thousands of financial experts at our fingertips to tell us how to protect our money and grow our wealth. We had the promise of thousands of highly educated, well-credentialed health and nutrition experts to tell us how to live healthier lives. We had thousands of lifestyle coaches and gurus to tell us how to empower us and tell us how to empower our own lives and lead more satisfying lives. So we had all this promise, and fade out, fade in, one generation into all this digital promise, and we're poorer and deeper in debt than we were 20 years ago. We're fatter, far more obese, and susceptible to lifestyle degenerative disease like heart disease and diabetes and all these things that come with living sedentary lifestyles, that ride shotgun with sedentary lifestyles in a highly chemicalized environment. And we're far more anxious and fearful than ever before. We're chronically sleep deprived. And we're half the population is on psychotropics right now and on medication, and the other half can't wait to see the doctor to get a prescription.
Yeah,
So
it's a
all
shame.
this promise leading into the 21st century that were derivative of the dot-com era and the dot-com boom, with all these promises made by this youth generation movement of 20-something people who had never failed and had no foothold in reality in life, all of a sudden it's showing up 20 years later in all these massively backwards and massively problematic situations, spiritually, socially, emotionally, and physically.
Yeah, I absolutely 100% agree with everything you just said. I think that the quality of life, we we as society have lost a quality of life that well, I think we desperately need to get back to. We all want a quality of life. We all want. I, I, and when I want to make sure I say this correctly the way I'm thinking because my brain's working faster than my mouth. Um, you, I have watched in my lifetime and my career, I have watched people in what I feel are various stages of the quality of life. Understanding, I've gone to places where into homes where unfortunately there's elderly people in there that they've been bedridden for weeks and nobody's come to visit them. This is way back when 20 years ago, 25 years ago. But you see people in a quality of life from those perspectives where elderly were being neglected, children were being neglected. You see housing, not as bad as it is today, but still people were homeless. But today's day and age, I think that the quality of life based upon the utilization, and yes, we're on a digital media at the moment, the utilization of digital media has degraded the quality of life to a point where we don't know how to have a conversation with people anymore. We don't know how to pick up the phone and call your mom, your dad, your grandfather, your grandmother, your aunt, your uncle, your brother, your sister, because everybody wants to text. So I think we've lost the personality, the personable connection with someone. So instead of hearing the voice, instead of hearing compassion, humanity, sorrow, joy, happy, what we see is a text with an emoji.
Yes, well, we see our electronic ghosts, the Pluto's shadows on the cave wall. That's what we see. That's all we see.
Yeah.
The body, the corporeal body, has been removed from the situation, and that's why there's no accountability anymore, because we don't have any concept in the 21st century now, or generation into the 21st century, of how our behavior might affect others. So accountability, when I was growing up, if you did a good job, you would be rewarded with more accountability, more responsibility. Nowadays, everyone's fleeing from accountability and hiding in their smartphones, and accountability has become a pejorative. It's a personal threat.
Yeah.
Is how people see it. And it's because we've removed the distance, or we've greatened the distance between the push button and the human act. Jacob Bronowski, the gentleman who did The Ascent of Man, the wonderful PBS, or it was BBC Ascent of Man series 30 years ago, plus years ago. It was a wonderful series. Talked about the distance between the push button and the human act. And as he's talking about this, he's kneeling in an ash pond in Auschwitz, and how the ashes of 3 million people have been flushed into this pond. And this is what happens when it's not because of science, it's what happens when we turn science into dogma, in the way it was with COVID, in the way it is with almost all things medical industry right now, and the way it is with just ideology at large. My father once told me, my father was a great baseball writer. He was one of the Mount Rushmore baseball writers of the 50s and 60s, at a time when the very best journalists in the country were all baseball writers. They were just great storytellers, and colorful. And this is before the migration from print to broadcast, when everybody's audience was still in the great metropolitan daily newspapers like that. He once told me, in a moment of weakness, I think, because he wasn't much for sharing fatherly advice, he said that you can either be an ideologue or you can be competent, but you can't be both. Mm-hmm. And what we have nowadays is institutional ideology, that everybody in charge of the institutions now is an ideologue, which explains why the institutions are decaying at such a rapid rate now, because they don't care about functionality. They care about saying the right thing so they don't get fired tomorrow.
Instantaneously.
Yes. Yeah. So we have, I refer to America and Western society at large now as institutionally as a one-party town. That all the institutions, the Fortune 100, all the major NGOs, all the major government agencies, they're all basically extensions of one political party right now, and basically money laundering organizations for the Democratic Party right now. Now, I'm not a fan of the Republican Party in any way, shape, or form, but I think they're both old and sclerotic and way too entitled, because entitlement always starts at the top. It's not a grassroots thing. It always starts at the top. All of those, what they call entitlement programs, at the end of the day are just table scraps, what's left over when after the guys at the top have stolen everything that isn't nailed down.
Yep, I agree with that. Yes, I do agree with that.
So that gave rise, and that's been part of my thinking for a long, long time now, and has given rise to the concept of Huxwell, the rise of Huxwell, which is the documentary that I'm working on now, trying to crowdfund right now. Well, Huxwell is basically an amalgam. It's a 21st century totalitarian dystopia that combines the compliance mechanism of state-sponsored default addiction and that's borrowed from Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, with the enforcement mechanisms of 24/7 surveillance, linguistic thought control, state-manufactured hatred via mass formation psychoses, and the institutional tyranny borrowed from George Orwell's 1984. So when I talk about the rise of Huxwell, I'm talking about the amalgam state of Huxley and Orwell, a compliance mechanism of state-sponsored default addiction, and the enforcement mechanism of tyrannical institutional scale, digital scale. Those are the two components that I saw coming together in the early 21st century that caused me to turn state's witness and become the digital apostate. It was the idea of the rise of a state-sponsored default addiction with runaway digital scale that manifested as institutional power. And now our lives are all about institutional power. I had a conversation the other day with a very bright gentleman and he was saying to me that the technology is what we make it. And I said, well, that's true up to a point, but all technologies have institutional biases. I'm not talking about Republican or Democrat or progressive or conservative. I'm talking about the medium is the message, a la Marshall McLuhan, whereby in print, for instance, when print became a mass medium after the invention of the Gutenberg press, when print became a mass medium, the first thing that happened was it destroyed the Western theocracies in Europe and gave rise to nation states and promoted linear thought and reason and gave rise to the American French industrial revolutions and the scientific method and the Enlightenment and the primary social construct that came from mass print was democracy. And then the early 21st century, we moved away from that with the rise of electronic media in the form of motion pictures and radio. And the primary biases of electronic media are the exact opposite of print. They don't promote reason and linear thought. They promote tribalism and emotionalism and big personalities. So it's no mistake that guys like Mussolini and FDR and Woodrow Wilson and Churchill and Stalin and Mao and Hitler all arose in the presence of radio and newsreel footage. And the primary social construct and social economic construct of electronic media, digital, most specifically, especially digital, is fascism. That doesn't mean that you have to wind up ultimately in a fascist place. It just means that's the natural tendency of societies that deploy electronic media as the primary communications and functional tool set.
And you can absolutely see that in politics today. You can see it across mass media. You can see it with Facebook and Twitter or X now, I guess. Facebook and X and Instagram and Snapchat. I mean, all of them. You can see the instantaneous communication of any type of verbiage or visual, whether it be audio or visual, out in an instant to masses, to millions. It is the modern day version of them dropping leaflets.
The internet has made possible in the 21st century 3 mass formation psychoses that I've identified anyway. The first was 911, in the aftermath of 911, when the entire country united behind what became this disastrous, Patriot Act, that basically where we sacrificed our civil liberties for the phantom potential of safety and security. And then the second one was Trump derangement syndrome after 2016, when half the country went absolutely nuts. And then the third was, of course, COVID, which I always interpreted as, at least in the blue states and cities, as an extension of Trump derangement syndrome, and it became more about getting rid of Donald Trump than it became about getting rid of COVID. Again, I'm not a big fan of the Republicans or Donald Trump for that matter, but I just think right now that the Democratic Party is inordinately dangerously large and powerful, and it's time to go away.
I think it's time for both Republicans and Democrats and progressives to reevaluate where they stand in society and what their objectives need to be and what their objectives should be, and whether or not they represent the people or their own ideals, which is a whole nother conversation we could delve off into for a couple hours. But I think that unfortunately, it also brings that back to multimedia. It brings it back to digital media in such a point. I grew up in a newsroom. My father was a journalist. I mean, from the age of 3 or 4 years old, I remember this vividly. Working in Gazette-Telegraph in the newsroom and watching him type or go on a call with him where he was going out to do a story.
You were all blue-collar guys back then.
Yes, and it was an amazing thing for me and my father to experience during that time period. And it also gave me a value for the written word and for integrity and for
the responsibility, the objectivity of the reporter.
Exactly, and it allowed me to grow up. I grew up and went to work for Gazette-Telegraph, where my father did. In fact, working with some of the people that my father worked with that were still there, because I think I told you he passed away when I was young. He was only 39 years old. So it coming from that and respecting print and respecting from a journalist's point of view and an individual that loved his job as a journalist, and in sitting in a newsroom and hearing people tap away on typewriters and then eventually computers, it gave me a respect for the type of message that was given out. Nowadays, the opportunity for falsehoods or the opportunity for a campaign of misdirection is unfortunately instantaneous. and it
Yes,
goes out to millions instantaneously. And the responsibility and the ethics and the morals involved in that, no matter which party that they're from, I think have been disregarded.
I think the
And
question that raises, Michael, and it's a really, really important question, and thank you for bringing that up. I think the question that raises is it preferable to live with the disinformation, or would you prefer the censorship that would seek to get rid of certain information, would come at the expense of certain information and at the glorification of other information? So, which is really what the Twitter files was all about. And it's really where we wound up with all the, what I call the techno media cartel, the Facebooks and the Twitters, and I guess X now.
cartel.
Um, yeah, yeah.
I love that. I love that. Look, coming from, I still have a cop's mentality, right? So cartel, I think, oh yeah, that fits.
Oh, yes. Oh, no, they make the Mexican and Colombian cartels look like dime bag dealers in high school bathrooms, these guys. These guys are powerful. And if they decide to shut someone up, they can do it any which way from Sunday without running afoul of anybody for 15 years until some forensic accountant uncovers the trail and then takes another 20 years to figure out who said what. That's why there's no accountability. That's why people feel free to try and get away with
Yeah.
with stepping on a Biden laptop story, or shutting people down, and they got rid of a sitting president from Twitter. They eliminated, and Facebook. They they took him off the air. Where else does that happen except a third world nation? And again, I'm not a fan of a big fan of Donald Trump, but boy, oh boy, this is just what's happening right now is really dark, and we're going to be in it for some time to come.
Well, how do you feel? I mean, we've only got a couple minutes left here, but when you talk about the quality of life resistance movement that you've started, tell me a little bit about the quality of life resistance
Part of the
movement.
life resistance movement, it was formed. I put it together as an antidote to Huxwell. All right, now that we're living in a state of Huxwell, what do we do? Where do we go from here? How do we improve the quality of life? It was predicated on my observation back in the early 21st century that with the rise of state function in the confluence of state-sponsored default addiction and the rise of runaway digital scale, the quality of our lives started to decay over time. It was absolutely apparent and undeniably measurable in spiritual and all meaningful metrics, spiritual, social, emotional, and physical. So my thinking was, all right, what can we do to start and try and restore, given the fact that Huxwell is here at least for another generation or two? What can we do to restore the quality of our lives as a grassroots resistance movement? It doesn't have to adopt political overtones or undertones. These are things that you can do for yourself, for your family, and your community. Those are the three basic pillars that quality of life resistance movement addresses, and there are three specific calls to action associated with the movement. The first is what I call turning away from diversion. That means you turn your attention away from the 10 to, find a way to whittle 2 or 3 hours a day out of the 10 to 15 hours that the average American spends consuming electronic media these days. Turn it away and turn it instead towards the things that contribute to the quality of your life: faith, family, and community. Those are the three basic pillars. The second call to action is to do what we can, given that we're in a state of default addiction, and that all addiction by definition describes a state of excess in our lives. The real question is, how do we moderate our behavior? Not how do we abstain. I think there's plenty of evidence that suggests that abstention doesn't work for any narcotic very well. Although if it works for you, go with God, more power to you. But by and large, statistically speaking, the only real solution en masse and also individually to addiction is moderating our behavior, learning how to live with our addictions and or moderate our own lifestyles. So in that regard, the idea is to find ways to gradually reintroduce meaningful ritual into our lives. And meaningful ritual is any ritual that contributes to your spiritual, social, emotional, and or physical well-being. So, it could be going to the gym. It could be practicing yoga. It could be waking up in the morning and saying morning prayers and thanking God or some larger entity than yourself. It could be sitting down with your family at the dinner table. And when you sit down with your family at the dinner table, you're satisfying all four basic needs. You're beginning spiritually by thanking the people, by whether or not you say an actual prayer, you're basically thanking someone somewhere for the opportunity to sit down with your family. You're communicating with your other family members, so there's a social benefit. There's an emotional benefit because communicating with your family generally makes us feel better, makes us feel more protected and secure and able to go out and take on the world. And also physically because it provides sustenance and physical safety for us. So the call to action number 2 is about finding ways to gradually reintroduce meaningful ritual into our lives, which is exactly how you backwards engineer all addictions, by the way. That's how all programs work, regardless of the technique. They all do the same thing. They all reintroduce meaningful ritual into your life over time. And finally, the last call to action is, return to local autonomy. So, and that's the answer to top-down centralized authority, which is how everything is concentrated nowadays. Everything comes at us, in the media, not least, especially the media. It all comes from some guy in a suit and a tie, seated behind a desk, who doesn't give a rat's ass about what's going on in our homes or our backyards or our communities. So the third call to action is to do what we can to clean up our own backyards and pay attention to our neighbors and our local communities. Those are the 3 calls to action. And there's a complete and comprehensive tool set on quality of life resistance movement, 3 discrete tools, each of which is scalable. You can use it for yourself. You can use each one for your family. You could even extrapolate them and use them for communities as tools for community planning or school boards or whatever. They're completely interchangeable and extensible that way. And these are things I put together many, many, many years ago in response to what I felt for myself was things starting to get away from me.
Which is a brilliant calls to action. I think that it's an opportunity for us to be able to reevaluate our situation, where we stand, and our relationship with the digital media world, not just digital media world, but digital world in totality. How we utilize it, how we market, excuse me, how we integrate ourselves within it, and kind of step away for a minute and understand that our quality of life may not be what we think it is, and to go back to what it should be. Even with
it's not about reclaiming the past as much as it is about reclaiming the future. Just using things that are proven to work. There are no moving parts in any of my calls to action or any of my tools. It's pretty simple, straightforward, basic stuff.
Easy to work. Let's talk a little bit about how to get in touch with you for your calls to action. I know you've got a book. You've got a documentary film that you are crowdfunding, and a Welcome to Quality of Life Resistance Movement website that can help people to be more educated and maybe hopefully get inspired and motivated and so forth. So tell us all about that and how to get in touch with you.
The Media Addict's Handbook you can find on Amazon. I wrote that back in 2012. It was actually a sequel to another book that I'd done that had a more faith-based approach, but it's essentially the same approach in the same book. And that was published maybe back in 2007. So the Media Addict's Handbook is available now on Amazon or Barnes & Noble. You can just look up Jeff Einstein and they'll take you to it. The Rise of Huxwell is a crowdfunded documentary that I'm just still raising money for now, and I'm into the scripting process and early production. That's at riseofhuxwell.com. You can go there and contribute, click on a button and contribute if you'd like, or read the original essay that's also posted on the Quality of Life Resistance Movement. Go to the Quality of Life Resistance Movement at qolrm.substack.com. And the first essay there is Welcome to the Quality of Life Resistance Movement. Click on that and we'll tell you all about the development of Huxwell, the Quality of Life Resistance Movement as the antidote to Huxwell, the 3 calls to action, and the Quality of Life Toolkit. And you just go on from there and explore everything else on the site. There are a lot of essays from yours truly on the site, some political, mostly not political, but everything has political undertones, I guess, nowadays. But I try to stay clear of that as much as I possibly can.
Yeah, it's a great, there's a lot of great essays on there. I've read several of them before this interview and over the last week. And I think that, it's worth checking out, number one. Number two, I would encourage people to investigate a little bit further and research whether or not they want to help you to move that documentary forward. I think it's a valuable project.
Thank you.
I think it's something that needs to be told. So, we'll get involved. I'll make sure there are links in the show notes so that people can get to both places for you.
Great. Thank you so much.
This is, thanks, Jeff. We could talk for another hour. I wish I could. So maybe I can have you back on. You can come back and we can continue the conversation.
I'd love that. Anytime, buddy.
This is one more thing before you go. So before we go, do you have any words of wisdom you can share?
I would just say that, try and remember the quality of life is a function of time, of how and where and with whom you spend your time, and faith and money.
Brilliant words of wisdom. Yeah, brilliant words of wisdom. Thank you for that. I think we all need to kind of look around and bring humanity back together.
Whenever possible.
Whenever possible, exactly. Yeah. Value the compassion, the human touch, and the voice. Yes. So anyway, like I said, again, thank you very much for being here. It's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for reaching out. I will have you back on the show, and I look forward to having another conversation.
Likewise, a real pleasure, Michael. Thank you so much for your time and for the exposure. I really appreciate it.
And for everyone else out there, one more thing before you all go. Have a great day. Have a great week, and thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to this episode of One More Thing Before You Go. Check out our website at beforeyougopodcast.com. You can find us as well as subscribe to the program and rate us on your favorite podcast listening platform.